Oh, hello, everybody. I was just looking at everybody connecting, getting quite a few. I think we're supposed to have a big group for today's pivot table session. Yeah, today's pivot table session or pivot table webinar is advanced pivot tables for deeper analysis. Um, we are using Zoom today. So if something happens with your connection today during the webinar, just go back to your email and click the link again, and you'll just reconnect to the webinar, pick up where you left off. Also, the webinars are recorded. So within 48 hours, usually from the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link that will take you to a YouTube recording of the webinar. So, even if you miss something, you can go back to it in the recording. So you usually get it within 48 hours. But all the mics are muted right now. If you do have a question during the webinar, guys, just pop it into the chat. Oh, you can't hear me? Okay, Mel will deal
I
with that. Can
can,
anybody
yeah,
hear
I
me?
can hear you, Christine. So I'll chat with these ladies separate, okay?
There's two. Okay. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, just put it into the chat and I'll get to your questions after the webinar. If it's something like a short question that I can get to while I'm teaching the webinar, I might do that. I'll glance over there once in a while, but there's a good chance that I'll wait to the end just to keep things running smoothly, and then I'll get to your questions. Um, And yeah, Mel's here to help you if you do have any technical issues, like you can't hear me. She's helping a couple of the participants right now. So, Great Canadian Training. Who's Great Canadian Training? I've been working with Great Canadian Training now for 6 years. Fantastic, fantastic company. I have to say, it really is a fantastic company. They've been around for over 20 years. They've been doing training, consulting services and things like that for over 20 years. So they've been around for a long time. We do software and professional skills training. We do it for public training. We do private training, private group training. But whether it's private or public training, all of the training is live instructor-led sessions. We can do it online. A bulk of my training actually is online, but we can also go on site at customers' locations. Or if you happen to be in the Ottawa area and you want to bring a group in to a training center, we do actually have a training center downtown Ottawa. So we can handle groups at our training center as well. And like I said, we also provide coaching and consulting services and custom database and app support as well. We do it all. And so many reasons I can tell you guys to take training or ask you guys to take training with us. But one of the main reasons that always pops out to me is that actually there's two. I'm going to bring up two this time. Our courses are always guaranteed to run. So if you need a course at a specific time, you don't have to worry that, if it happens to be a slow time of the year or people are on vacation and you happen to be the only person in the course, it's not going to be canceled. So that's kind of nice. Also, I've been getting a lot of feedback lately that everybody loves the customer service as well. We do offer fast, quality customer service. So many reasons to take training with us. But yeah, I'm Christine. I've been with the company for over 6 years, doing professional and technical skills training. And before I was with Great Canadian Training, I was teaching at York University in Toronto. So if any of you guys are from Toronto, hi everybody. I was there for a long time. I'm not going to mention how many years, but yeah, basically doing the same kind of training and course development at York University. And fun fact, I always mention this if you guys have been in the webinars before, if I'm not training you, I am in a show called SOS, the ABBA Experience. We travel around North America doing shows. Actually, I'm about to go on tour in a week out to the East Coast. We're going to be doing PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. So if you're an ABBA fan, come check us out sometime. Okay, so today's webinar. So this is an advanced pivot tables webinar. It's assuming that you know your basics of pivot tables. Now, guys, if you're attending this session and you're thinking to yourself, uh-oh, I don't know the basics, I'll show you a little bit of the basics when we start. I don't have a lot of time to get into the basics. However, we did run a webinar a while back called Pivot Tables Made Simple. And Mel's going to throw the link into the chat. Yeah, there you go. She's quick. She's thrown a link into the chat. If you ever want to go back and watch that, that will give you some basics of pivot tables. And then today's session really centers more around some of the advanced features that, you know, if you took a pivot table session with us in an Excel level 3 course, for example, even some of these features, we wouldn't have time to get to some of these really cool but more advanced features. And I do find some of the most seasoned pivot tables users, if I show some of these features, they'll say, hey, I didn't even know you could do that in pivot tables. That's kind of what this webinar is about. So we're going to look at changing the layout of your pivot tables, because there are 3 different types of layouts that you can change for pivot tables. I'm going to show you how to group. I'll show you a couple of grouping options in pivot tables. I'm going to show you how to work with fields, items, and sets. And then I'm going to show you a little trick to generate a whole bunch of pivot table reports in one click. And then I will show you how to drill down into the underlying data. So if you're looking at a pivot table that's summarized and you want to see the underlying data, there's a way to drill down into your data. Okay, so let's jump into it. I'm going to switch over to Excel. Give me 1 second. Close the million things that I have open on the screen. And you guys will kind of enjoy this. So the Excel data, so we have our Great Canadian Training and Consulting Company, and we found out that so many members of the Great Canadian Training and Consulting Company have music backgrounds. So we decided to start a Great Canadian cover band. So our Excel workbook that we're looking at today is all centered around our Great Canadian cover band. So we're looking at things like, we have a mailing list here of people across North America. I think it's just across North America that we send mailouts to. We have, I'll switch over here to a tour schedule. So all of our show dates starting in 2021, the cities, the regions, the countries, things like rental costs, insurance costs, lots and lots of data. And then we also have a sheet for merch sales. We sell merchandise. We sell t-shirts and baseball caps and notebooks. So we have lots of data in this workbook, rows and rows and columns of data. The idea behind a pivot table is pivot tables summarize your data. So you're looking at sometimes hundreds of thousands of rows of data, and you're going to have questions about your data, or you're going to have stories to tell about your data. So for example, if I go to the tour schedule sheet, I might have questions like, what is the total sum of ticket sales per city, or per country, or per venue? So I want to group it by the venue and see the total sum of ticket sales. That's the kind of thing that a pivot table is going to do. It's going to summarize your data. It's going to tell a story of your data. It's going to create a nice little compact report based on your thousands of rows of data. And it's as simple as drag and drop. So I'm going to start creating my first pivot table. You'll see what I mean by the drag and drop, and then we'll jump into some of those advanced features. So the first pivot table I'm going to create is going to be based on this tour schedule sheet. So I'm going to click my cursor anywhere in my data. Doesn't matter where. And I'm going to go up to insert because we're inserting a pivot table. So the insert ribbon at the top. And I'm going to click directly on the button here that says pivot table. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you an option that's found under the little drop down. But right now I'm going to click directly on the button, which is just going to create a standard pivot table. And it's already picked up my range of cells that I want to base my pivot table on. So this whole range of data, A3 to A1, or sorry, I133. And I'm going to put the new pivot table on a new worksheet. I like to put most of my pivot tables on new worksheets. You can put it on an existing, but in this case, I'll put it on a new. And I'll click OK. So it starts a brand new worksheet in this workbook. On the left side is where your pivot table is going to show up. On the right-hand side here is your pivot table fields task pane. So basically what you're going to do to build a pivot table is you're going to drag the fields that you need in your pivot table into the appropriate box below. Now, this is where I don't really have a lot of time to get into the basics of a pivot table. So go back to that webinar that Mel put in the chat if you want your basics. But before I build this pivot table, I want to show you guys something. I'm going to go back to the tour schedule sheet. We have a column for ticket sales here. I'm going to select this column. So I'll select column I. I don't know if you guys know you can do this, but when you select a column of numbers, if you look down at your status bar down at the bottom where my mouse is, it's going to give you some stats based on these numbers, like the sum of those numbers. So it's telling me that the sum of all these ticket sales is 4,803,850. If you can remember 4,803,000. Okay, that's the sum of our ticket sales. Now watch this. If I go back to sheet 1, which is where I'm going to build my pivot table, and I go to the right-hand side here, the pivot table fields task pane, and I drag my ticket sales field into the values box. I'll zoom in here. Take a look at my pivot table. There's the same number. It's giving me a total sum of the ticket sales, 4,803,850. The default for a pivot table, when you drag a field over here on the right, if you drag a field that contains numbers into the values box, it's going to sum your numbers. And in a few minutes, I'm going to show you guys another option because sometimes you're dragging fields that don't have numbers. They could have text into the values. We'll see what happens then. But if it contains numbers, it's going to give you a sum. So what we're seeing is a total sum of all the ticket sales like I just showed you on the other sheet. This is a pivot table. It's a very summarized pivot table, but normally you have more questions about your data, like I want to see the sum of ticket sales per city or per region or per country or per venue. So I'm going to go back up to my field list here at the top. Let's start with city. Let's say I want to see the ticket sales per city. I'll drag my city field into the rows box and watch what happens to my pivot table. Now I'm seeing the ticket sales per city. And at the bottom, it will give me a grand total. Okay, this is a pivot table. It's telling a story about your data. I could get rid of the city field. Watch this. I'll go to the city field here and I'll drag it right out of my rows box into my spreadsheet and let go. It's gone. And I could drag country into the rows. Now I'm looking at the sum of the ticket sales for the country. I could get rid of country, drag the venue into the rows. Ticket sales by venue. Pivot tables are fantastic. So let's look at some of the advanced features. So I'm going to get rid of the venue field from the rows. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag Okay, let's drag the years, the show date. No, you know what? Let's do it this way. I'll drag the country into the rows and I'll drag the city as well into the rows column, into the rows box. Now take a look at the pivot table. So because I have both the country and the city fields in my rows box, it's grouping it by the country with a subgrouping by the city. And it's giving you the sum of the ticket sales. Now, this is what a typical pivot table looks like when you do grouping with subgrouping. But there are actually different layouts that you can choose. So when I'm teaching a pivot tables course, quite often somebody will say to me, Christine, is there any way of taking the subgrouping, which is the city? You see how the city field is in the same column as the country field. So it's all in column A. It's just that the city field is indented. But is there any way of taking the city field and putting it in a separate column from the country field? Absolutely. If you go up to your pivot table, you have two pivot table ribbons at the top, Analyze and Design. If you go up to the pivot table Design tab, right near the beginning of the pivot table Design tab is a Report Layout button. So if I click the Report Layout, compact mode for a pivot table is what you're looking at right now. But if I change it to Outline, it's going to take the city field and it's going to put it into a separate column. Now, it's still a row down from the country field, but it is in a separate column. If you want to bring the city field up to the same row as the country field, you can do that as well. I can go back to Report Layout, Tabular Form. So now you have them in separate columns, but they're on the same row. And by the way, you don't have to show the subtotals if you don't want to. I could also go up to this design ribbon right near the beginning here where it says subtotals, and I could choose not to show subtotals. I could put it back. Okay, so you do have a choice of changing the layout, the way things are displayed. Now, this is if you're doing grouping with subgrouping. I'll put it back to compact form. I'll just show you something. So if I put it back to compact, the way it usually shows in a pivot table, if I were to remove the city field, so the only thing I'm looking at in the pivot table is the country and the sum of sales, those layouts are really not going to do anything for you. If I go to the report layout and I change it to outline form, you really don't see a difference. Tabular form, you don't see a difference. It's only when you get into the grouping with the subgrouping that the layouts change. Okay, so I've put this back in compact form, but I am just showing the country now, the grouping by the country and the sum of the ticket sales. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you in the same pivot table how to group. Rather than start a new pivot table, what I'll do is I'll remove the country field from the pivot table. So I'll go over here to the rows box, drag the country field out. So we're back to the total sum of sales. And this time I'm going to put the show date into the rows box. Now let me show you something. This pivot table is based on our tour schedule sheet, right? So let me remind you, if I take you back to the tour schedule sheet, here's the show date column. They're actual dates, the full date, day, month, year. Now watch what happens if I go back to my pivot table when I drag the show date field into my rows box so I can see the sum of sales per show date. Ready? You don't see the show dates. Now, I do have to warn you guys, if any of you happen to be in an older version of Excel before 2016, it will show you the show dates. But starting in Excel 2016 and later, what Microsoft has now done is if you drag a date into your rows, it's going to automatically group it by year. So it's looked through my whole column of show dates and it says you have dates in 2021, 2022, 2023, 24, okay? And you'll notice little plus symbols beside those years. If I click the plus symbol beside 2021, it will drill down and say you have show dates in quarter 1, quarter 2. So it automatically splits it up into quarters, not government quarters, by the way, guys. It's like your typical January, February, March is quarter 1, April, May, June is quarter 2 kind of thing. If I drill down into quarter 1, we have dates in January, February, March. If I drill down into January, there are 2 dates in January. So it has grouped it by the year, the quarter, the month kind of thing. You are not stuck with that. You can change the way it's showing in the pivot table, the way it's grouping. And the easiest way to do that is to right click on any one of these years in the pivot table. So if I right click one of these years, I can go down to group. So it's grouping it by years, within years, the quarters, within quarters, the months. And then just by default, it will show the date. I can remove all this and I can choose how I want it to group. Like I could say I wanted to group it by the years and the months. Forget about the quarters. When I click OK, now it's grouped by year and the month. Now it does expand your whole pivot table. I'll show you a little trick here so you can collapse it all down to the years again. You can just right click on one of these years, go down to expand collapse, and then you can choose to collapse the entire field. It's really a quick way of bringing it back up to just the years. But now if I drill down into the years, like if I drill down into 2021, it's just the months I see. And what's kind of neat about it is if you keep an eye on your subtotals, if I'm collapsed all the way to 2021, this is the amount of ticket sales, the total ticket sales for 2021. But the minute I expand it and I show the months, I will actually see the total ticket sales for January, for February, for March, plus the subtotal for 2021. I could even do this. Maybe I just want to show it by month. So I'll right click the year, go down to group, take out the years, just show the months. There you go. Now your pivot table is by month. So yeah, you can change the grouping. Now I'm going to show you something kind of cool with grouping for numbers. So I just showed you grouping with dates. I want to show you grouping with numbers. Now I'm going to name this sheet. We're going to end up with a few sheets. Really good practice, guys, to give your sheets names so you don't lose track. So I'll double click on my sheet down here and I'll just say something like sales by month. Something like that. Okay, we're going to create another pivot table, this time based on the mailing list. I think it's the mailing list that has the ages. Do I have ages here? Yes, I do. I have a column for ages. I don't know, my brain didn't see it at first. So I have a column for ages. What I'm going to do is I want to count how many people I have per age. So I want to see kind of the ages of the people that are following us, really, a count of the ages. So I'm going to create a pivot table. I'll click anywhere in my list, go up to my insert, pivot table. Again, it's picked up my whole mailing or my list here. Always make sure it's picked up your whole list. And I'll put it on a new worksheet. Okay. So I'm going to drag the age field into the rows. So I get a list of the ages. So we have people from the age of 31 down to the age of 78, which is great, a good range. And I want to count how many 31-year-olds we have, how many 33-year-olds. We don't have any 32-year-olds on the list, that kind of thing. If you drag a field that contains text, not numbers, text, into the values box, you can't sum text, right? It's not going to try to sum the text. It's going to default to count. It's going to count. So for example, if I drag the last name field into the values, it's going to count how many last names there are for the age of 31, how many names for 33, how many names for 35. Like we have one 31-year-old, one 33-year-old. We have two 37-year-olds, that kind of thing. So anytime you drag a text field into values, it will count. But the thing is, this pivot table kind of looks funny this way. I'm going to show you how I can group it and show the ages a little bit better. So I'm going to right click on any one of these ages. Let me zoom in for you again. Right click on any one of these ages. Go down to group. And we have 31-year-olds to 78-year-olds, but I'm going to round it off to 30 to 80. So I'll change the 31 to 30. So the range is going to be 30 to 80. And I want to group it in groups of 10 years at a time. So start at 30, end at 80, group it in 10 years groupings. So I'll click OK. And look at that. So between the ages of 30 to 39, we have 7 people. 40 to 49, 13. 50 to 50. So you can see actually looking at this here's the story it's telling. Really between the ages of 40 and 59 is where most of our demographics are for people attending our shows. So many different options for grouping. Okay, I am going to name this sheet, I'll call it subscriber count by age. Okay, the next thing we're going to take a look at is working with fields, items, and sets. 3 different things, fields, items, and sets. And I'm going to base my next pivot table on my merch sales, my merchandise sales. So we have the different years of the sales, the different categories, clothing, accessories, stationery, the specific products per category. And then we always forecast our sales before we sell for the year. So our forecast, what the actual sales are for that year, and then the variance, so the difference between these two numbers. Okay, so I'm going to click anywhere in the list. Same thing, up to insert pivot table. I'll put it on a new worksheet. Okay. Okay, so we'll start with fields. Fields are a way of adding calculations to your pivot table that don't exist in your data. So for example, if I create a pivot table, what are we going to do? Okay, we're going to put the category into the rows. So it's grouping by the category. And I want the sum of the actual sales. So I'll put that into the values because it's going to sum my sales. Let's zoom in here. So here are the categories and the total sum of sales. But this is the sum of sales before the tax, before the 13% tax. I want another column here that tells me what the sale is, including the tax. Now, yes, I could go to my original data. I could add another column in my original data that does the calculation. And then, yes, it would be here and I could add it to my pivot table. But sometimes you don't want to do that. You don't want to edit your original data, or sometimes you're basing your pivot table on somebody else's data. You don't want to play around with their data. So what you can do is in your pivot table, actually create the calculation. So it's only part of the pivot table, not the original data. And that's what the fields option will do. It'll create a calculated field, meaning add a new column. So I'm going to go up to my pivot table analyze tab, and I'm going to go way down the ribbon near the end of the ribbon There's a button that says fields, items, and sets. So I'll click this button and we're starting here with calculated field. So I'll click calculated field. I need to give a name to my field because it is going to add another column here and I'll want a name for my column. So I'll call this sales including tax, something that makes sense, obviously. And then I have to put what my calculation is, my formula. The 0 that's in there is just a placeholder. You can delete the 0, but leave the equal sign in there because if you guys know, if you've ever done calculations in Excel, you always start with an equals. So leave the equals. But my calculation is basically the actual sale times 1.13. Okay, if I multiply by 1.13, it will show me what the sale is, including the tax. So I could type the field name in here, but I'm always making typos. So what I usually do is I go down to the bottom here where all the fields are, and I double click. So I'm going to double click sales actuals. So the field sales actuals times, which is your asterisk, 1.13. So there's my calculation. I'll click OK. And you just added another column with that calculation. Now what it's done, when you do create a new field with a calculation, it automatically puts it into your pivot table. For it to show up here in my pivot table and do this kind of number summarizing, what it's done, if you look way down into the values box here, you now have another field in there, the sum of sales including tax. If I didn't want this column in the pivot table anymore, I could get rid of it by dragging it out into the spreadsheet and letting go. But don't worry, you don't have to recreate it again. It's now there in your field list above sales including tax. If I want it back in my pivot table, I can just drag it back into the values and I'll get my sum of sales including tax. So that's a calculated field. A calculated item is a way of doing kind of like a calculation, but within a field. So for example, if you look here where my categories are, we have accessories, clothing, collectibles. Okay, so it's grouping it by the category. What if I wanted to do something like, instead of seeing the individual accessories, collectibles, home decor, and stationery, I want to combine those 4 items, add them all up and combine them into one category called mementos. That's what items will do for you. So if you're going to work with items, you click on a single cell. Make sure you don't have a row selected like I just did by accident. You won't have the items option available. You click on a single cell and then you go up to fields, items, and sets, and you'll have calculated item available. So I'm going to give a name to this new calculated item. I'm going to call it mementos. Mementos. And then the formula is going to be, I'll get rid of the 0. I'm on the category field and I want to take the accessories and add them to the collectibles and add those to the home and decor, and then add that to the stationery. So we're combining those 4 categories and adding up all the numbers. I'll click OK. And we now have a new category here called mementos with a total sum. But the thing is, be careful, guys, because when you're looking at the grand totals here, this grand total now includes your mementos, but it also includes those individual items, the accessories, the collectibles, okay? So it doesn't really make sense. If I'm going to have mementos in here, it doesn't make sense to be showing the individual accessories, collectibles, and things like that. So I'm going to filter those out of this pivot table. So up where it says row labels, I'll click the drop down and I'll remove, I don't need to see accessories, collectibles, home and decor, and stationery. Okay, we just have mementos, all of those combined. And then I could do the same thing with clothing and music. I could create a category called lifestyle and combine those. So I'll click on a single entry, go up to fields, items, and sets, calculated item. I'll call this one lifestyle. And the formula, get rid of the 0. In this case, it's going to be clothing. So we'll double click clothing plus music. Click OK. And now we have lifestyle, which means we don't really need to be showing clothing and music anymore. So I'll go up and filter those out. I don't need clothing or music. So now we have a combination of mementos and lifestyle. Kind of a neat way of doing it. And I didn't have those categories in my original data, but I have it here in my pivot table. You still have all the other items available. If you don't want to show mementos and lifestyle, you could always go into your little filter button, put all of your items back, and then remove mementos and lifestyle. But they're there now for you if you need them. So that's what items does. It combines information in one column, whereas fields creates a whole brand new calculated column. Now sets. Sets is a different beast. It's really cool, but it's a different. Can you show the original items in column B? Like, are you saying are you talking about putting them back in again? Oh, putting them back in and removing mementos and lifestyle. Like I could put all these back in like this and remove mementos and lifestyle. But you can't, I don't know of a way that you can see, yeah, both, but like have two separate columns, one that shows mementos and lifestyle and one that shows the other column of individual. I don't think there's a way of doing that if that's what you're asking, Sarah. It's kind of like in this column, you have a choice. That's kind of like what it's like. I'm going to just, I'll call this sheet, actually, I'll put it back the way it was. Okay, I'll go back, I'll end up answering your question in a little bit. I'm going to put this back. Actually, I want to remove all these and I'll go back to your questions as soon as what do I want to leave? As soon as I finish the webinar, absolutely, I'll go back to your questions for sure. Glad you're asking questions. Keep putting them in there, guys. Okay, I'm going to call this sheet sales of mementos. I don't know if I could fit all this. I won't put a space. And lifestyle. Watch me run out. Oh, I got it. Okay, so I want to show you guys sets. Sets is pretty cool. I'm going to go to the merch sales sheet again. Now I'm going to remind you guys before I show you sets, take a look at your merch sales. We have the sales forecast. So what we're guessing our sales are going to be for that item, what our actual sales were, and then the difference between the two. So we actually made $2,390 more than we thought we were going to make for the classic t-shirt kind of thing. Okay. So I'm going to create a pivot table based on this information that shows the category with the sum of the sales forecasts and the sum of the variance. Okay. Now, to be able to use this sets option I'm about to show you, when we create the pivot table, you have to add the pivot table to the data model window. Just out of curiosity, have any of you guys worked with Power Pivot? you want to give me a thumbs up if you've worked with Power Pivot? I don't know if any of you guys have. Yeah, I'm getting yes, no. Oh, a couple of you guys have. Okay. Yeah, we teach a Power Pivot course. It's pretty cool. Now, I'm not going to get into actual Power Pivot with you. So don't worry, it's not a whole Power Pivot lesson. Although some of you may be going, "Oh, gee, I wanted Power Pivot." But the data model window is a special window inside Excel that allows you to work with multiple sheets of information, combine them, link them together, create relationships, and create really powerful pivot tables. It's amazing. Now, I'm not actually teaching you guys Power Pivot, but the sets feature that I'm going to show you will only work if this data here is in the data model window. Now, I'm going to do it in a way that if you've never used Power Pivot, you don't have to worry about it. You're not even going to see the data model window, but we can still add it to the data model window. So I'll click anywhere in this list. I'll go up to Insert, Pivot Table. Again, I'm going to put it on a new worksheet, but this is where it's different. I'm going to go down here to the bottom where it says Add this data to the data model. I'll check that off. Click OK. Now, I'm starting a regular pivot table based on data that's in the data model window, but you can't see the data model window. I could show you later where the data model window is if you want, but it is actually in the data model window. Now I can work with sets and I can show you what sets are. So I'm going to put the category field into the rows, so it's grouped by the category. And I want to see a sum of the sales forecast and a sum of the variance for each of the categories. But I want to see it by year too. So I'm going to drag year. Now I haven't put anything in the columns yet. I'm going to drag year to the columns and take a look at what happens to my pivot table. So I've got all of my categories here. I've got the sum of the sales forecast and the sum of the sales variance for 2021. Then for 2022, sum of the sales forecast, sum of the sales variance. Then for 2023. Now I'm going to tweak a couple of things in here. Like this is a really wide pivot table. First of all, that's a really long name, sum of sales forecast and sum of sales variance. I'm going to change that. I'm going to double click here where it says sum of sales forecast. Now let's just change it to, I don't know, sales forecast. Click OK. And I'll do the same thing here. I'll double click. I'll call it just sales variance. So that shrinks it down a lot. I also don't need any of the grand totals to show you what I want to show you. So I'm going to go up to the Design tab. And right near the beginning of the Design tab, I'm going to go to Grand Totals and I'll turn off the grand totals. So zoom in. What we're looking at here is for each category, the sales forecast summed and the sales variance for 2021. Forecast variance for 2022, forecast variance for 2020. Okay. Now, the issue with this is good, except the issue is if you look at the 2024 data, we have the forecast and the variance is basically the same as the forecast, just in a negative number. And the reason for that is if I take you back to the merch sales sheet, we have filled in all the actual sales for 2021, 2022, 2023, but we're currently in 2024. We don't have the sum of sales yet for 2024. I'm going to plug those in at the end of December. So if we don't have our actual sales, we can't subtract our forecast from our actual to get an amount here. So really, our amount is just basically the negative of what we forecast because there are no actuals. So when we look at our pivot table, they're basically the same. So I've decided for now, I don't really need to see the sales variance for 2024. I want to remove this. But the problem is, if I go down into the values and I drag variance out of the pivot table, I'm going to lose all the columns that say variance. I don't want to do that for 2021, 2022, okay? Only 2024. And there is no way to go into your filtering and say, I don't want to see the variance just for 2024. Don't show me the variance. Like if you remove the variance in any way, it's going to remove it from all those years. But there is a way to do it with something called sets. You can create a set where you can tweak little pieces of the data. So I'm going to go up to the Pivot Table Analyze tab, down to the button Fields, Items, and Sets. And you can create a set based on rows or create a set based on columns. Now I am creating the set based on columns, right? I'm dealing with the sales forecast, sales variance, sales forecast. I want to be able to remove the sales variance column from the 2024 year. So I'm creating a set based on column items, and it's giving me all the options I have for the columns. So for 2021, we're showing the sales forecast. For 2021, we're showing the sales variance. For 2022, the forecast. 2022, the variance, and so on and so on. When we get down to 2024, it's showing both the sales forecast and the sales variance. I don't want to see the sales variance. Now I'm going to give a name to my setup here. I'm going to call it, I don't know, 2024 variance removed. Give it a meaningful name. Because you can have multiple sets and you can switch between different views of the multiple sets. So you want to give it a name that makes sense, that when you select it, you'll know what you're going to be seeing in your pivot table. And then down here, I'm going to select this last row by clicking, and I'll go up and I'll delete that row. I don't need to see the sales variance. I'll click OK. And look, guys. Yeah, you could hide the two columns, but then if you're doing calculations, the calculations will take into account the columns that you hid. So if you do hide columns and you do any calculations, it'll still include those, but this won't. Yeah. And it's really nice too, because you can create a bunch of different sets, kind of like different views of your data, and then you could remove and show different sets just by click, 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 as opposed to having to hide and unhide. It's a good point, Susie. But yeah, this just makes it easier. Pretty neat though. Okay, I'll get to your questions in a sec, Chris. I'll just show you guys the last two things. So that was fields, items, and sets. Last two things I was going to show you. Oh, this is really neat. When I found this, oh, it's good. It made my life so much easier. I'm going to, I'll go back to my merch sales data. I'll create a pivot table based on my merch sales. You guys are going to be such experts at creating pivot tables in a minute. So I'll go up to insert pivot table, new sheet again. I will put the category in the rows and I'll sum the actual sales. So here we go again, same old pivot table, group by the category, sum the sales. But I want to be able to filter this pivot table by the year. Like maybe I only want to see the sum of sales for 2021 or 2022. Now, I don't have the year field in the pivot table, which means the way it stands right now, I can't filter it and say, I just want to see it by 2021. So one way to be able to filter this pivot table is to, by the year, I mean, is to add the year field over here to the filters box. So if I drag the year field down into the filters box, it's going to add a row above my pivot table that's going to allow me to filter by the year. So I could go and click this drop down and say, I only want to see the sum of sales for 2021. Click OK. And now it's filtering by 2021. And I didn't have to put the year field in the pivot table to do that because I didn't really want to show the year field in the pivot table. Now, some of you may know you can do that. Okay, that's not what this little tip is about. I'm going to put it back to showing all the years. Now, let's say I did this and I'm thinking, you know, I would really, oh, by the way, I don't need to see the mementos and the, what was the other one? Lifestyle. I'll have to filter those out. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, I'd really like to have a pivot table that shows the sum of sales for 2021 like this. Okay, done. But I want to leave this one like this, and I want to have another pivot table that shows it for 2022. Then I want another pivot table that shows it for 2023. You know, that type of thing. And what I see people doing is making a copy of the sheet. So copying the sheet, then going in and filtering in the new sheet to 2022. Then make a copy of that sheet and going and filtering it for 2023. Like, it's a lot of work to create all those separate pivot tables, you know, filtered by year. Well, if I put the year field in the filters, and right now I'm going to set it to show all years, I can have it generate several like separate pivot tables filtered by each year on separate sheets in the click of a button. So I'm telling it to show all years here. I'll go up to my pivot table analyze tab. Right at the beginning, the options button, if you click the little drop down beside the options button and choose show report filter pages, watch what happens. Yes, by year. That's the only thing I have in there. Okay. Now look down at my sheets here. So I have the 2021 sheet, sum of sales for each category by 2021. 2022, filtered 2022. 2023, 2024. Well, we don't have anything for 2024. It created those separate pivot tables for me and filtered them based on what was in my filters box really quickly. So that's under your drop down for options. Show report filter pages. Yeah. Yeah, saves you a lot of time. And then the other thing I was going to show you, the very last thing, and then I'll look at your questions. If you're ever looking at a pivot table, like I'm looking here at accessories, the total sum for accessories here for 2023, here's the amount. I want to know what the data is, the underlying data from the original data that gave me that number. If you double click a number in your pivot table, it's going to drill down and show you the rows of data that number was based on. So if I double click here, it starts a brand new sheet and it says it's getting a sum of the numbers based on these rows of data. Now, just remember, every time you double click a number, it's going to start a new sheet. And it's really easy to forget that, and you keep double clicking numbers and you end up with a whole bunch of sheets that you've drilled down into. So what I try to do is when I drill down and I look at the underlying data, I usually delete the sheet so I can right click the sheet, delete it. And if I want to see the underlying data for the collectibles, I can double click. That's based on these 3 rows of data. And then again, I would just delete the sheet. Otherwise, yeah, you end up with a lot of sheets. But yep, you can keep drilling down into data and see the data that it's based on. So let me take a look. A couple of you guys were sending messages. Can you show the original items? No. Can you create a field and combine the items? Lydia, I'll get to that in a second. I'll go back to that in a sec, Lydia. Susie, could you not? Oh, we talked about that. Chris, can you create a table from a list formatted with the header on the side? Can you create a table from the list? Chris, can you remind me which pivot table I was in when you asked me that question? Was it based on a specific pivot table?
I think she just means instead of having all of your titles at the top, say you had a spreadsheet with them along the side instead. Like actuals was on the side and variance was on the side, on the left side. I think that's what.
Like this. So for example, let me, I want a smaller, maybe the merch. Oh no, I'll do the tour schedule. So if I create a pivot table like this, and I have my cities showing, I've been putting them in the rows and summing the ticket sales. Instead of having each one listed in the rows, you want them across the top. So I could put city in the columns. So now Amsterdam, Atlanta, Barcelona, you can just choose between rows and columns. Is that what you're talking about, Chris? Before you can create the pivot table, you need to create a table, but my header is on the side. Oh, like your original data, your headings like this are on the side. Oh, no, your pivot tables are based on column headings. So your column headings have to be at the top. However, there is a you can transpose your data. So for example, well, right now my column headings, I'll zoom out. My column headings are on the top. If I wanted to put them on the side like you have it, I could select my data, copy it, and I'll just do it down here for fun. It's a paste special feature, so I could go up to the drop down under paste. And this button right here is transpose data. This little clipboard right here. So now it's transposed it so that it's this way, the way you're talking. So if it's this way and you want to make it like this, do exactly what I just did. Select all your data, copy it, and paste it transposed, and it will flip it around. Yeah. Pivot tables are based on a format where each column is a different field, not row. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah, you answered the advanced Power Query course. Yeah, we do. I teach a Power Query course. Oh, I love Power Query. And I teach Power Pivot. Power Pivot and Power Query are great. Using the fields, items, and sets, calculated field. I'm adding a formula, but only showing as a count, not the calculation. What do I need to change so it shows the result of the calculation? You're adding a formula and it's counting and not summing. What is it that you're counting? What's the field that you're counting? Is it a number field or is it a text field? It's a number field, Janet. And you created a, are you saying that it's before you even create the field that it's doing a count in your pivot table instead of a sum? Or is it, are you saying you created the calculation and the calculation isn't working properly? I'll only have a couple of minutes. Okay. Is counting, not summing. I'd have to see your calculation, Janet. What is your calculation? Can you copy and paste it into the chat while I look at one of these other questions? I have to see what you're doing and what your calculation is. Can a slicer like year be added to the table, not a pivot? You can add slicers to a list, but the list has to be a data table. So if I take this list right here and I turn it into a data table, press Control T and click OK. So Control T, will turn your list into a data table. As long as it's a data table, you can go up to insert, where's my slicer? And you can use slicers. If it's not a data table, it doesn't let you use slicers. So you have to turn it into a data table. Okay, Susie. Okay. And Susie had asked, was it Susie that asked that question back that I have to look at? I'll look back at the questions and see if I missed anything in the questions. And we'll follow up with an email. I'm just going to look at Janet's calculation field is whatever the field is less than or equal to 120. Okay, that's not really a calculation, Janet. You're trying to basically kind of do a filter saying you only want to see anything that's greater than or equal to 120. So it's not an actual calculation. A calculated field is an actual calculation, like this times this plus this divided by this. So you can't really do that. Does that make sense, Janet? So it might be that you're trying to do something that you can actually do in a pivot table, but not through a calculated field. So I'd have to know what you're trying to do to tell you how you would do it in a pivot table. But that's not a calculation. Okay. I think I got them all, but there is one that I'm going to go back to that somebody had asked that I never really got to. I think. So I'll go back anyway, and we'll follow up, guys. If I've missed something here, we'll follow up. We'll send you an email. Okay. So I hope this helped you guys. Yeah, Chris, nice to talk to you. You're so welcome, everybody. It's almost the weekend. Oh, and by the way, we're celebrating. This is the 50th webinar that we've run. So you guys have joined the 50th webinar. I was going to mention that at the beginning and I forgot. So cool. You're so welcome, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon and great weekend. Oh, thanks, Leonore. Thanks. You're welcome.
Thanks so much, everyone. And just keep an eye out in
Bye.
your inbox. I'm going to send an email in a couple days that's got this and information on our courses and our next webinars. Okay. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
So I'm going to go ahead and close the room.